Each year as we begin the holiday season in December, we celebrate the very best of the Solari Report. This coming week, in our first part, we publish our picks for the top selections from our Solari Report series: Food with Pete Kennedy, Wellness with Bridget Mouchet, Future Science with Ulrich Groninger, and Food for the Soul with your culture scout, Nina Hine. From the food series with Pete Kennedy, we've chosen his interview with attorney Elizabeth Rich in the trenches with Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. It all began with those magic words from Elizabeth when the law meets up with food, quote, "I'm an attorney and I'll work for milk." This is in-depth intelligence from two attorneys who've made a life-changing difference for small farmers, inspiring us to make Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund a lead recommendation for our Take Action crowdfund. This summer, I was speaking with a subscriber who was considering how to reinvest the proceeds from a sale of a property. Part of her challenge was selling a property in the middle of a major economic attack on the economy by the central bankers and the implementation of numerous controls and restrictions. I said to her, "What's the point of having more assets if you don't have an army to protect them?" That was the inspiration for Solari's Take Action crowdfund, designed to inspire growing membership and financial support to several organizations that are leading armies onto the legal battlefields in an effort to protect all of us. The Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, Children's Health Defense, and a network of independent writers and publishers who help bring transparency to the issues they help litigate. A big thank you to the subscribers who've supported these efforts and kickstarted a very successful launch. Pete Kennedy is the host of our food series and a founding member of the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. I first got to know Pete when we became a member and contributor in 2011. In fact, the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund was our big Christmas donation that we do at the end of every year. The legal battles that Pete and his colleagues have waged are hard and complex work. To help you understand Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, I asked Pete if he would invite litigator Elizabeth Rich to help you understand the power and importance of what this team of attorneys has accomplished and why we need to support them to keep doing what they're doing, sending them back into that legal battlefield. I hope you're inspired by the difference that Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund is making for all of us. From the Wellness series with Bridget Mouchet, we have chosen Strengthen Your Immune System by Addressing Intercellular Oxidative Stress, an interview with Thomas Levy. This is filled with numerous practical ideas to return you to a strong immune system, the foundation of wellness, and keep you there.
A biomolecule in your body, whether it's nucleic acid, protein, sugar, enzyme, you name it, is either in a normal called reduced state with a normal amount of electrons, or it encountered an oxidizing agent and lost some electrons and it's in an oxidized state. Well, when it's in an oxidized state, a biomolecule is either rendered less active or completely inactive. So you might have an enzyme, and when you oxidize it, the enzyme no longer works. And the point of that is that all disease is a unique array and concentration of different oxidized biomolecules in different locations. No matter what the disease is, it's a unique array of these oxidized biomolecules. And to the extent that you can take those oxidized biomolecules with an antioxidant like vitamin C or something else and recontribute electrons back to that oxidized biomolecule and put it in its normal reduced form, then the biomolecule regains its normal biological function in biochemical reactions or whatever else it's involved in. And the point I like to make about that is that there is nothing more to any disease than these arrays of oxidized biomolecules. In other words, if you have Alzheimer's disease, the cells in your brain that are affected by it don't have some ill-defined disease that's being labeled Alzheimer's. All it has is a unique array of different biomolecules in different locations and different concentrations being oxidized. And that's the case for any disease. And ironically enough, it also works with infections. You can't have an infection if the cells that were infected are able to regain a normal intracellular level of oxidative stress, no increased oxidative stress. So the other point of this is that there's a lot about biology that's complex, and there's a lot about biology that's simple. I just gave you the simple version of what disease is. Now, remedying a disease is the complex part, because your goal is to normalize the oxidative status of those biomolecules. And it involves more than just taking in a large amount of antioxidants, primarily because you also need to look at what's initially causing the ongoing oxidation. And let me say right here that the word toxin really means pro-oxidant. A toxin is an oxidizing agent. So they're synonyms. Something that oxidizes is toxic. Something that's oxidant is toxic, both ways. So then you have to ask the question, well, what's supplying the ongoing new toxins or oxidants in my body on a daily basis so that the antioxidants that I bring in on a daily basis can't repair more than is newly damaged? And that's infections. Infections are the primary source of pro-oxidants or toxins that are generated inside your body.
In future science, make sure to listen to Hyperdimensions with Ulrich Groniger. Accessing our power requires learning how to access the power of higher dimensional thinking and communication. Learning these possibilities from someone who has mastered both the science and the ancient spiritual teaching is the great way to start.
So now that we have learned to recognize and identify some of the characteristics of hyperdimensional structures and their traces in our own space, three-dimensional space, let us look at some of the areas where we find footprints of hyperdimensionality. And one of the most fascinating areas is our own minds, that according to recent research are utilizing high-dimensional mathematics for the processing and computing of cognitive events. Ultimately, this should not be surprising. For if space is high-dimensional, then also all of us, all of our full being is connected to that hyperspatial reality. We do not exist in a space that is separate from us. We ourselves are spatial beings, spatio-temporal entities that do not so much move in space, but with a high-dimensional space. And that is the vision that we can take away from learning about hyperdimensions, and that I believe have fundamentally practical implications on how we see our personal position in life. So what was discovered for the brain? It was found that the brain, observed here in its electrical activity of firing neurons, employs higher than three-dimensional structures in its neurological processing. This is a discovery of the Blue Brain Project, and scientists at the École Polytechnique Fédérale in Lausanne, Switzerland. The Blue Brain Project is working on a digital reconstruction and simulation of a complete brain network, using algorithms that combine all of beforegoing knowledge from biology and neurosciences. So this project is a vast endeavor of mapping all the interconnections of neurons in a biological brain. They made this remarkable discovery, namely that whenever the brain is active in receiving stimuli and processing information, the neurons that are firing are not just responding ad hoc or based on the intensity of the electrical signal, but rather the firing neurons are forming geometrical structures, combining a number of simultaneously firing neurons into a group or clique of neurons. This was first published in Frontiers in Computational Neuroscience in June of 2017. Here we see the reconstructed brain network or tissue of neurons. And here we see such a clique or group of neurons that are firing together. These cliques of neurons or groups of neurons can be treated as geometric simplexes, which are basically hypertetrahedra, the same that we have seen as one of the fundamental four-dimensional solids in the previous section. The firing neurons are treated as the vertices of the hypergeometry or polytope, and the connections or dendrites between simultaneously firing neurons are the edges of each structure. The more vertices and edges the simplex has, the higher its dimension. In the case of the rat brain model that was used, for example, there were 31,000 neurons that would correspond to vertices and 8 million connections, dendrites, between them, or that would correspond to the edges of the hyperdimensional geometry. Now, these networks of activated simplexes are analyzed by algebraic topology, which is the study of spaces and positional relations within spaces, the study of manifolds, of groups, knots, and complexes. This is a mathematical geometrical tool that is also used for questions of packing and distribution. Think, for example, of the close packed structures in molecules, such as our DNA. Or think back to the structure of space and the packing question of galaxies and galactic clusters. So when interpreted by algebraic topology, the brain network reveals its hidden high-dimensional structures in terms of a whole complex of simplexes. The simplexes can be connected at the vertices or neurons, they can be connected at the edges, or they can even be connected at the faces or the volumes that make up the different dimensional hypertetrahedra.
If you looked at a movie of neural activity with neurons spiking here and here and here and here, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to detect any pattern in the firing. But when you look at this pattern of firing through the filter of algebraic topology, different structures emerge in terms of which families of neurons are firing in which order, and then more complex structures when you look at how these different families are related to each other. When one looks at the evolution of such a pattern through time, it gives us a mathematical signature that describes this pattern that was hidden in the seemingly chaotic firing of the network. What I think that we're seeing here is a way of interpreting or visualizing the brain's own code for what it's doing. It processes the information, it's encoding the input signal, and then it's coming to some sort of decision. And what algebraic topology enables us to do is to describe that encoding process and perhaps even to visualize the moment at which the brain is making a decision. So there are more and more intricate structures among these neurons that are building up as it's thinking about, it's processing the information, and then boom, we come to a decision. Whoop! And that's what we're detecting. We're detecting the information processing and decision-making processing of the brain.
So what is found is that the brain is not linear or not even three-dimensional, but the mathematical topologies employed are usually multidimensional, up to 7 and 11 dimensions. The simplexes are combined into what is called cliques and cavities that together produce the high-dimensional structural information. This seems to build and last until it suddenly disintegrates again as the brain process seems to have been completed or achieved a certain state of decision. As one of the researchers says, it is as if the brain reacts to a stimulus by building, then raising a tower of multidimensional blocks, starting with rods, one-dimensional, then planks, two-dimensional, then cubes, three-dimensional, and then more complex geometries with 4D, 5D, etc. The progression of activity through the brain resembles a multidimensional sandcastle that materializes out of the sand and then disintegrates. And this is continually going on at any moment in our brains. Let's think about this for a moment. Imagine reconstructing the dynamics of these high-dimensional clique formations in real time for a human brain. And that is exactly what they are doing in the Blue Brain project, the modeling and simulating of the human brain, which ultimately is said to lead to better artificial intelligence. But imagine what happens when the mind begins to see its own dynamic and evolving topology, which is higher dimensional. Its topology of thinking reflected in that simulated brain. What happens to our brains as we see that? I believe that rather than giving it all over to artificial intelligence and supercomputers, if enough of us can hold that gaze onto the reality of our own brains, that the mind in seeing itself will be so totally and spontaneously amplified that any AI will be left behind thousands of years just as it was until now. To me, this is this moment of bifurcation that Catherine, she speaks about momentary experience that she had in an insight, where suddenly she saw this bifurcation. This is a moment of singularity, but it will not lead to the dominance of AI. Rather, provided enough of us can see this, can understand it and work with it, it will change our minds so dramatically as we see the hyperdimensionality looking back at us. And finally, when we see the dimensional topology of the brain network in reference to the cosmological topology with which we started out, and the close packing of space, we may have a cascade of insights into how consciousness may be inhabiting the whole of the universe. There is one more aspect about the topology of the brain, or the geometry of thinking, that I would like to talk about before we move on to physics and higher dimensions. And that is conceptual or cognitive spaces, which is literally the brain representing concepts much like a space or a location. This is what Peter Gardenfors, a Swedish cognitive scientist, calls the geometry of thinking. And he's asking the question, how does the brain learn new concepts and learn it very quickly? The traditional idea of the human mind is very much like that of a computer, like a Turing machine, working with logical symbols. But these ideas and models fall short of explaining the speed with which new concepts can be learned and integrated, and creative ways of thinking can be achieved. How do we recognize patterns and similarities so quickly? How do we deduce or generalize from particulars? Gerdenfors says that we can do this because we represent information in geometrical spaces in the brain. As we have seen with the Blue Brain project, this is quite literally topological spaces, but it is also, according to Gerdenfors, that the brain represents concepts also in the same neural circuitries with which it represents space and location outside. And that is the region of the hippocampus, which functions like an inner GPS system. The hippocampus contains so-called place cells, cells that only show activity or only fire when the observed animal finds itself in a particular location. It was originally thought that these cells in the hippocampus, place cells, represent an absolute map of the brain's environment, of the organism's environment. However, it turns out that the map is malleable, the map is adaptive, is relative. So place cell activity is not determined by absolute space surrounding the animal, but by the animal's own history and experience of position. And furthermore, and this was published by scientists working for Google DeepMind, the place cells in the hippocampus are not only representing a relative map, but a predictive map of where the animal or the organism will go in the near future. Other studies have shown that place cell activity is also influenced or modulated by the location of other animals of the same species. That means that place cells in one animal would fire or be active when the animal is watching other animals going to the same place. The scientists are calling those social place cells. I find this very remarkable, and it makes me wonder if the whole social distancing experiment that we are observing now is perhaps really a giant experiment on place cell mapping. Is the whole mystery of space perhaps mapped or coded into the hippocampal brain cells of a species? And how does the extreme seclusion and separation that we live through now affect our brain maps? We also do not see other members of our species so much any longer moving around us, so we could receive a relative brain map. What does this do to our sense of space? And could it be possible to attenuate or eradicate a species brain map of space and reprogram it?
In Food for the Soul, your culture scout Nina Hine and yours truly discuss lost art stories, celebrating Nina's Lost Art column series, the first destroyed, the second missing, and the third recovered, and we share our personal experiences with the lost and founds of the art world. If you're looking for great movies, museums, and cultural experiences, make sure to check out the recommendations from Nina's Food for the Soul column. It's a personal favorite, truly not to be missed. These 4 selections for the best of the Solari Report Series 2020 give you an opportunity over the holidays to connect with 4 of the most inspiring people I know. Enjoy.